We're happy you could all come in spite of Bandh and other disruptions which are not very unusual for our country. So I'll request our director, Professor V.S.Ramamurthy, to make the opening remarks and we get started. Professor Ramamurthy.
Admiral Vijay Shankar, friends, good morning to all of you and welcome to NIAS once again. What's happening in Iran? What it means to us? What it means to the rest of the world? These are some of the questions which are agitating the minds of many people in India, abroad, everywhere. If you are a regular reader of Western press, and if you are also a believer of what is printed there in those press, you would by now be convinced that Iran is a rogue state. It has an active nuclear program, civilian, of course, for energy. It is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Since NPT allows civilian nuclear program, up to that there is no problem per se. But there are reports that there is evidence of enrichment activities in Iran. The nuclear watchdog says, IAEA, says, we suspect enrichment. I am not aware of any specific instances where they have hard evidence. On and off we hear there is evidence, some suspicion. There is no evidence. So I really don't know. I have attended several meetings, not formal meetings, corridor meetings, even in Vienna. And it's not clear what exactly is the situation. I don't know. You also realize that, therefore, I don't believe the Western press 100%. I have a certain amount of reservations on what is printed there. Of course, Iran keeps saying no, we don't have an enrichment program to take us to the weapon domain. But we do have an enrichment program because NPT says under the NPT we have a right to enrich for civilian use. If I can have a civilian nuclear program, why can't I enrich for that purpose? An argument which of course is not accepted by the Western world, but an argument we keep hearing from Iran on and off. But the conclusion from the Western world is they are defaulters, they are violators of the agreements, particularly the NPT norms, and therefore needs to be controlled, maybe. The matter has gone right up to the Security Council. We are aware of the 3 Council resolutions and consequent sanctions towards military hardware, sanctions towards oil exports from Iran, gas exports from Iran, sanctions on banking, a whole range of them. One after the other, they are all coming here. Where it will lead to, we don't know, but we certainly believe that things are not cooling down. They are actually raising the temperature. Where it will start boiling, I don't know. Irrespective of the assessments, it's clear the comfort levels of people like us are not very high. We do feel a little uncomfortable on this. Iran is not yet another Middle East kingdom. It's not one of those kingdoms of people who are moving from place to place on a camel, and then suddenly they discover they have a pot of gold under the camel. No, Iran is certainly do not belong to that class of countries. It has a very long history. Iranian culture has been as long as civilization has existed. In fact, my state, Tamil Nadu, former Chief Minister Karunanidhi says that I come from the Aryan clan, the invaders of the Aryan invaders, that means I also belong, my forefathers also belong to Iran and in that part of the world. So it has a very long civilization, no question on that. More importantly, even in the recent decades, it has had a good educational system. I still remember the Pahallu University in the pre-70s, Pahallu University, and I vaguely remember, I don't know when I went there, when I saw it, or was it only photographs, I don't remember, but they said it is exactly a replica of University of Washington at Albany. The same architect designed it, they built it. They had a large number of international faculty, including some professors from India, and their education system has not been bad. Their S&T system has also not been bad. Late 90s, I did visit Tehran, and I went to one of the biotechnology laboratories. It's a very well designed and constructed and had some specific achievements to their credit. And I was also somewhat flattered to see that the boss of that center said that I am a student of an Indian institution. He studied in India before starting this center in Tehran. So clearly, Iran is not something which can be taken off as a country which suddenly can't do that by some clandestine method. They have a strong foundation. They have also been allies to us in many instances. Iran has been a friend of India, whether it is a matters of Afghanistan or Pakistan or many other issues. They have been our allies. And of course, even my wife knows that we are talking of getting the energy supplies, the natural gas from Iran, and one of these days that we will have plenty of fuel. Today, 31st is a clear day when we are reminded of our dependence on the external world for our energy supplies. So Iran is something which we cannot ignore. So at the back of our mind, when you are lying upside down and not thinking of anything other than some random thoughts, we start thinking, are we seeing a repeat of Iraq, Libya, and things like that? You know, there is many people do believe that the weapons of mass destruction bogey was floated around basically to settle some other scores. And then we saw the entire thing, and today we see that no great achievements have been put on record, whether it is Afghanistan or Iraq. I don't think the war has left a better place to live. Not only in Iraq and Afghanistan, in the entire world, it has not made the world a safer place. But the kind of messages which we were getting at that time, that they are sitting on a stockpile of weapons of mass destruction, and we have to settle this once for all and ensure that the world is a safer place to live. Doesn't seem to be right. So these are matters of concern for us. What is happening? Of course, the bottom line is, with so much of dependence on Iran for our energy needs, we have an immediate stake in it. What happens in Iran is of importance to us because we are dependent on them. We need a lot of energy from outside, resources from outside, and Iran is a major supplier. We have enough problems already because of the sanctions on the banking sector. We have to worry about how to pay. And there is no unanimity on this, and then sometimes we are also seen as allies of our enemy. My enemy's friend is also my enemy. We get into that syndrome. What is the impact on the other countries of this, let's say, the oil embargo or the gas embargo? It's somewhat uncomfortable to see that if there is a total ban on any oil or any energy resource import from Iran, who will suffer on the face of the earth? They are all Southeast Asian countries. So it appears as if that this part of the world is going to be more vulnerable for any disruption in that part of the world than the people who are imposing the problems. So these are issues which need to be discussed in detail. And then you may ask, okay, after all that you may keep on discussing, what happens? You are not a major player in this. You can't change the history because the history is being written by some other set of people and you are not one of them. Maybe true. But on the other hand, not knowing it, ignorance about what is the implication of all this is not a strength either. So whether we can change history, a different issue, but at least if you know that there is a need to change history, then we should, that's the first step. And then we will have to worry about what needs to be done. So these are very, very, as I see, it's a very, very complex issue, an issue which cannot be ignored, even if you can't do anything about it. Even if you are a helpless spectator in the whole thing, you shouldn't be a blind spectator. That's a very unusual combination, blind and spectator, but that's what we are most of the cases. So I'm very glad that Admiral Vijay Shankar proposed that why not we have a round table on this. And he is one man, of course, he has seen the world from a perspective of security. And you are all here. And I hope at the end of 2 days, we will be slightly having a better clarity than what we have at the moment, at least what I have at the moment. With these words, let me once again welcome all of you to this roundtable, and I hope you have a productive discussion. Thank you very much.
Firstly, let me thank Dr. Ramamurthy for giving me this opportunity and actually going ahead with this roundtable. Let me make a couple of confessions. Firstly, I'm not an Iran scholar. Secondly, I'm not an Iran watcher. And thirdly, I don't think Iran caused this band. But being a person who's operated in these waters, it always interested me that amidst this legacy of the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire, you have this state of 80 million strong that is very, very different to the Middle Eastern societies. I think Dr. Ramamurthy very, very aptly brought it out. They are not the same. They are indeed not the same. They have a 2,500-year-old history. They have the kind of forces that make for a democracy, because straight away, while Reza Pahlavi tried to resurrect the Achaemenid dynasty and failed in doing so, there remained the issue of modernity and Islam. Islam, as you know, recognizes only the religion as sovereign, not the people, not the constitution, not the parliament. And therefore, between these three, there have been wrestling matches going on in that countries, and what has now emerged is at a very nascent stage, and you can see that some sort of a compromise is being achieved between all three forces. Now, coming back to the issue of the war having begun in Iran. Now, wars do not occur because of misunderstandings. Wars indeed occur because of deliberate action taken on one part or the other. Sometimes challenges are posed before countries, and those challenges, if resisted militarily, cause a war. Sometimes this war takes a form of covert action, sometimes it's sabotage, sometimes it's sanctions. But in all cases, what is sought to be hurt, or what is sought to be changed, or what is sought to be effected is the Clausewitzian trinity, that is, the people, the military, and the government itself. Right. So having said that, let's take a look at this first slide. This particular trinity, when we look at the people of Iran, we see a solid foundation, as the doctor very rightly stated. I recall when we visited Iran, the Shah's Iran in 76, 77, we had gone with the fleet. What always amazed you was this difference. If you went to Tehran, Tehran was something out of Paris. The people talked French. While if you went to Bandar Abbas, you really saw the state of the common people. And this sort of a difference always existed. And yet, it was a country that had the sort of self-respect that most of the nations that you find in the Middle East today do not possess. It is not based on a single primary product. It is not based on a creation made by somebody who took a pen and a map and said, okay, Ottoman Empire has fallen, let's start carving up this place based on energy, avarice, and nothing else. It is not a state like that. The military itself, unfortunately, when you look at the state of affairs of the military as it stands today, their entire outlook to have adopted should we say, an asymmetric strategy does not in itself offer solutions. Because asymmetry today, if particularly you look at the maritime domain, will be taken out. The moment you are unable to get beneath the surveillance umbrella that anyone may put up, you are bound to be taken out in detail. And therefore, asymmetry in their military is going to cause more problems to the establishment than anything else. Because, let's face it, when a country is pushed into a corner, the strategy of the cornered is normally terrorism. And that has been historically the case. And here is this 80 million highly civilized country that is now being pushed into that sort of a corner, which to me will have an effect on the globe and the chances of globalization achieving anything at all. The third, of course, is the government. Now, this is the issue here. Yes, they have constitutionalists, they have people who are nationalists, they have people who are monarchists, and then they have people who are Islamists. The only answer is to find a compromise. If you see particularly a country like India, different forces does not necessarily mean that the country has to break up. It has to find a compromise, and we do believe that in time to come, this compromise will be achieved, and you can see it happening. All these bogies that are being created, that now they've achieved enrichment of 27% because they found traces in Nantas, reminds one of exactly what happened in Iraq. In Iraq, you may recall the yellow cake incident, which resulted in the exposure of a CIA agent, Valerie Palme, and because her husband went out there and said, hey, there's nothing happening in Niger. And for the presidency to actually go against that, because of having made a statement that Iraq is well on its way of weaponizing, and therefore that capability has to be taken out. The problem with the government in Iran today is it is facing a policy being implemented by a superpower controlled by a very small state in the same region, Israel. And this is a fundamental problem that exists there. Can a superpower actually skew its policy to run to the dictates of a very small country which has immense insecurities? Will it not always result in a certain element of strategic myopia? And I think that is what is happening there at the moment. We also noted that since 2006, there have been assassinations of nuclear scientists, 7 of them to boot, 1 a failed attempt. These are all indications of something building up. Nobody goes and assassinates a person and does not follow through with a certain amount of action. And you can see that this perhaps is just the start of military action. Unfortunately, Clausewitz also stated that war is more an activity of the defender and less one of the offender. Because the offender can pull out, the defender is going to be left without a hope in hell, and particularly in this particular case with the kind of military power that America can bring to bear, it would ruin the economy, it would ruin that country, it would ruin everything that we understand Iran to be. We noted there's been sabotage, and they've been using cyber war to actually sabotage their enrichment program. We've all heard of the Stuxnet and so on and so forth. And therefore, you can see that some sort of a build-up is being undertaken. You can also see that with the diversion of the oil produced from Libya and Iraq towards the requirements of Europe, Europe's dependence on Iran oil is going to end by July. America never depended on Iran's oil anyway. We'll talk about this a little as we go along. Political and financial isolation, we can see that this is happening, and all of it is pointing towards the breakdown of the Iranian society as we understand it. And therefore, for a nation like Iran to take it lying down, that's not going to happen. The only answer that it can respond with is globally disruptive nationalism. And you can see it's happening already. And lastly, what is perhaps worrying most countries is this, that the strategy of despair is going to lead to terrorist action. Very quickly, we'll just run through the kind of sanctions that have been imposed on Iran. First, there is the set of UN-imposed sanctions beginning with 2006 until 2011, which effectively stops the, should we say, the sale of heavy weaponry, the sale of any kind of equipment that could work towards their nuclear program, which is all broad-based statements. Tomorrow you'll say, oh, he's got a vacuum, what do you call it, a vacuum furnace, and if he's got a vacuum furnace, then it must be for nuclear usage. Vacuum furnaces are used left, right, and center for commercial purposes too. And therefore, you can see from every angle the economy is being targeted, not just by the UN, by the EU, and by the US. US, since 1979, has actually broken off all relations other than humanitarian relations with Iran, since the hostage crisis in 79. Is Iran's non-cooperation with the IAEA a setup? After all, how can I say the latest report, November 2011, IAEA states that Iran is indulging in activities which is consistent with the fabrication of a nuclear device? What does this mean? What is consistent? If I actually write a paper on atomic energy, is that consistent? And therefore, once again, I go back to that statement, is that Iraq template being applied? Russia, of course, this has caused a division in the world itself. Russia has outright rejected any further sanctions. They've said that what it has to do, it will do, and it will take time to happen if we want a decision to come. But any more sanctions is going to hurt the people of Iran. China and India have said no curbs on oil imports because it's going to hurt both economies to an extent that we may not be able to pull back from. The Baghdad meeting, as we are aware, was a non-starter. They've only promised to meet once again in Moscow next month. And as we come to July, when oil dependence of EU itself is taken away, I do believe that is the time to watch. This will perhaps put matters in perspective of where Iran's oil is going. China 20%, Japan 70%, India 16%, Italy 10%, and another 10% to Spain, Greece, and Turkey. South Korea 9%, others 28%. While in terms of the total consumption per day of the world, which is stands at about 82 million barrels per day, this might not seem very much. Why? Because the chief consumer of that 82 million barrels is America, standing at about 26% of the global consumption. And then as you whittle down the figures and find out what or who is going to be affected, clearly, as the doctor pointed out, it's going to be the Eastern economies. Right. India's stakes, so that we get a little focus into that perspective. It is the fourth largest oil consumer at 3.5 million barrels per day, 4% of global consumption, imports from Iran, as mentioned there, which amounts to 11.5% of imports. Now, the reported effect on our economy, should this supply get disrupted, is to the tune of 1.5 to 2% of economic growth, which means it's already been projected between 6 and 7%. It's going to fall to a level where you will find that the Indian growth story will not only end, but will probably go into deficit. I made a brief mention of this. Dampening of shock to EU, because before you can get the EU on board and provide this logic for war, you have to make sure that they're not hurt. Restoration of supplies from Libya and Iraq, ramping up of Saudi production, control of Libyan and Iraqi oil provided strategic logic for the recent wars, as also presents a convincing argument for war in Iran. After all, Churchill's two-pillar policy. Why was the Gulf important? Why was it necessary to cultivate Saudi Arabia and Iran? It was for energy. I call it energy avarice, but it was for energy which kept the wheels of progress going. EU import of 430 kilobarrels per day, ex-Iran balanced out by 680 kilobarrels per day, ex-Libya and Iraq. This is expected to be achieved by July. The last line is, I think, is self-explanatory. Now, Iran systematically has built forces that could wage asymmetric warfare. But when you're faced against a superpower, what are you doing? It's a very weak denial strategy versus a very, very strong control strategy. Theoretically, there's a problem here. Iranian strategy draws inspiration from guerrilla land warfare doctrines. In the maritime domain, it translates to inability to go beneath surveillance zones, threaten C-squared structures, or counter precision strikes, or breakthrough enveloping maneuvers, which means before even they start, this strategy is bound to fail as a military strategy. Let's take a quick look at the geography of the area that we are talking about. From the head of the Persian Gulf to the Straits of Hormuz, a distance of about 600 miles, of which the narrowest portion is at the Straits of Hormuz, which is about 34 to 35 kilometers wide, but only 4 nautical miles is usable by deep draft vessels. 20% of all global consumption courses its way through these straits, which amounts to about 5,800 supertanker hulls per year, dominated by Iran geographically, as you can see, but it does not favor submarine operations and large-scale operations. Neither does it provide any form of stealth. And therefore, while the vice president of Iran stated very stridently that we will not let a drop of oil pass through these straits, that really is more rhetoric. You can see that that is not going to succeed for a variety of reasons. In the 80s tanker war, after the initial hit on tanker traffic, you're talking about 80s when surveillance, control capabilities were all a fraction of what it is today. The attitude of shipping was something like this: 25% drop in the first 2 weeks, thereafter back to normal. And therefore, hitting tankers does not help anybody other than the insurance agents. It brings about flagging of, convoying of tankers. It brings in more military, which really increases the chances of all-out escalation in the war. Now, Iran's military potential is really one of, when you compare it to the superpower, is one of penury against plenty. And therefore, there is no comparison when you talk about the military potential of Iran to wage a successful military campaign in this area. Iran herself depends on the oil revenues. Whatever revenue she was getting will also close, which means she will do unto herself what the West is trying to do to her. A strategy of despair is a recipe for military and political harakiri. Now, Iran's nuclear program, you're all aware that Iran is a signatory of the NTP, and thus far there's been no real evidence to say they've actually transgressed any of the clauses of the NTP. They believe that what they're enriching uranium for is for their energy requirements, a legal requirement which even the NTP allows. But to Israel, and this is where the problem arises, Iran is an existential threat and cannot be permitted to go not any further, cannot be permitted to proceed with a nuclear program, however benign it may be. Now, when this existential threat to a very small state out there is translated as an insecurity of a superpower, then there's bound to be miscalculations, there's bound to be, should we say, action that was never intended, or its termination was never intended in the way it's going to happen. But clearly, stability is going to work. The deterrent value of Iran's nuclear program is actually in the mind. And what is in the mind? That Iran may have noted the difference in the West's approach to Saddam and Gaddafi as opposed to Kim Jong-il. Right, and therefore let me round off by placing certain issues before the RT, which I hope will be answered amongst a large number of other issues. The first is, what is this effect of US policy driven by Israel's insecurities going to lead to? Second, Iran, as we have stated twice already, is most unlike the other nations of the Middle East. They are not a legacy of the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire. They are not the legacy of a group of nations, energy avarice, take a pencil and paper and say, okay, let's make this guy the emir of this area. Why? Because he's very pliant. The nature of this war, which I'll be talking on a little later, nature of this war is as never before. We have never seen a war of this nature being waged, which unfortunately is heading towards a military action. Asymmetric conflict, I think we can debunk this theory that asymmetricity is going to shut down the Gulf and close all shipping to all the nations of the world. The first to be hit by such an act will be Iran. The course of history, Solzhenitsyn in one of his books stated that the course of history is often dictated by events that nobody predicted. And that is true. It is true of Afghanistan, it's true of Iraq, it's true of America, it's true of the Koreas, it's true of India too. So, was Iraq and Libya, the action taken there, a part of a larger scheme? And lastly, the impact on India's energy security. While I commend this slide to the RT, we would all be very interested in getting the ideas of some of the illustrious speakers who are going to come after me. Thank you very much for your patience.
I'm happen to be being drawn into this activity by a process of osmotic diffusion. I was here by, and I was simply drafted in. Happy to do so in many ways, an old institution that I've been associated with. We'll do it this way. I'll ask Vice Admiral Vijay Shankar to begin to give his presentation on the nature of this particular new war. We will then have, briefly, questions. In other words, if there's something that a speaker, in this particular case, Vijay Shankar, you haven't understood, please ask the question, but we will not have a discussion. It's just a clarification of the point. Then we will then proceed to Arun Vishwanathan, and thereafter it will be Krishnan. Same procedure, and immediately thereafter we can have a discussion with regard and the way in which the discussion will proceed will of course depend upon, to some extent, the manner, the content of the presentations that have been made. So may I now call upon Admiral Vijay Shankar to give his presentation, please. Thank you. Admiral Shankar.
Some may even say that I'm back like a bad penny. But there was one point that I had made in my introduction. That was the nature of this war. Because we will now assume that these war clouds have actually built up. It is now important for us to understand as to what form, what character, how is this war likely to play out, in the sense, not in the termination, but certainly how it is likely to play out. Because if we do not do these calculations, we would not be able to either rubbish the whole idea or, in fact, say this idea has some merit. All right, let's get down straight to it. I will not take more than about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we can move on from there, if there are any points that you want to discuss. Okay, there is no template actually to measure or analyze the nature of any war. The only one that was provided by Clausewitz. It's an important thing. It's very broad-based. He has also said that within the trinity of people, the military, and governments, things can weigh on any one of these three factors. And each factor has a whole host of sub-factors, and therefore really is not saying very much, other than to say that in any war you have to analyze these three factors. Now, once again, I cannot tire of stressing this point, that this bizarre anomaly of Israel driving US policy. While you have found that bigger powers have driven lesser powers in terms of their policy, in terms of their acts, it's never the other way around. And here it would appear is the case. Now, you may say it is because of the Jewish lobby in America, and you may well be right. But the fact remains, America is not just a Jewish lobby. After all, they have made some very good decisions in the past, very few and very far in between, like in 1956, during the Suez crisis. So it is not above them to make sane, good decisions. And yet we find that here is something so obvious, so bizarre, that it merits, or at least a thought of this round table. But you can see that if you have a smaller nation with lesser interests, smaller role to play in world politics, actually driving the policy of a superpower such as America, there's going to be a great element of myopia. And that myopia will show up in the kind of action that they take, in the ready willingness to shoot from the hip, and indeed, in some cases, even to lie and fabricate. It has occurred in the Iraq's case, and therefore there's no reason to believe it's not going to happen again, because establishments such as those in America don't really learn from their mistakes. They make them, and they believe that they have a right to make these mistakes on the grounds that some action is better than no action. And coming back to that statement by Clausewitz, that wars in the main are fought by the defender, not by the guy who's offending, because he can pull out and get packed and move 8,000 miles away, and there's not very little that anybody can do about that. Iranian people, I think we've talked about it, and we have an Iranian amongst us who will spend a little time on that. But Iranians are not Arabs. They are not people who are from the same mold as the Middle Eastern states. They have not been created yesterday or within the last half a century. They have not been created because of the crumbling of the Ottoman Empire. It was not the breakup of an empire. It was not the victors who carved up Iran. Iran has existed since hoary days. I mean, it's been there. They fought wars with Greece. They fought to the east in India. They've sent troops to Central Asia and so on and so forth. So they're not people that can be messed around with without some sane response to being messed around with. Because today, as we see, if you read the Western media, which is the only media that seems to be pushing out papers on Iran, you would actually believe that Iran has grown horns since 1979. You'll actually believe that. Because everything, like I gave that little incident of 27% enrichment. Why? Because somebody went to, an inspector went to Natanz and found a little particle, and which he analyzed and said, well, they've enriched to 27%. Next step is 90 plus. These kind of, should we say, conclusions, while make good reading, they make good press, they tickle the alarmist. I'm not too sure they have been borne out by any facts at all. Ends and means, when understanding what is the ends of each one of those protagonists in this, we must also note that there is a large community, global community that is going to be affected. While the effects might not be immediately felt in the West, certainly in the East, it's going to cause radical changes in our energy policy, which does not come quickly. It's not that you go from one petrol pump to another and pick it up. You still have to refine that crude that comes in. And each source of crude has its own set of peculiarities, and therefore the refinery has to be made for it. It's very costly to have a multi-purpose refinery and so on and so forth. So if this 11%, if this 11% is to be made good, then that 11% is going to be made good at considerable loss. I had mentioned that it may affect our economy to the tune of 1.5 to 2%. I think Dr. Arunachalam said that he had done some calculations which say 0.5. Well, these are issues that the experts will have to put down on paper to say it. These are the figures that I obtained, and it makes some sense, because the whole process of getting new sources of energy will take its time. You'll have to invest somewhere else, which is not going to produce any immediate returns. The genius of war. Now, the genius of war comes with experience of war, and there is no other country with the kind of experience that America has had can actually match up to it. Its generalship, its establishments, its ability to actually declare war without going through any democratic process, at least for 90 days, are all inbuilt into that genius to wage war. Hazards and friction, obviously what we talk here is more than likely not to ever happen. Obviously, some of the conclusions drawn by the experts may be well off the mark, as has been the case in Afghanistan, as has been the case in Iran, as was the case in Vietnam, as was the case in Korea, as was the case in China. These are things that perhaps are imponderables, and what would need to be done is establishments such as this to go deeper into it, to provide the kind of options that may come out at the end of this RT. In the second last point, exertions and national intensity, we're pretty clear that for America, it is a part of a policy. For Iran, it is survival. And for a survivor, his ability to accept or embrace any form that may ease him out of the situation will be done. Because that is the level of intensity, and that's a level to which their military will also be in a position or will believe it can exert itself. Information, we believe that we are ruled by information today, and we also believe that we have all the information we need. But the fact of the matter is, you're always surprised after the first salvo is fired, and therefore this information remains a source of friction. Do we have the correct information? The whole business about Tony Blair having reportedly told Bush Jr. that actually there's been a sale of yellow cake is a point to note. Something that was never verified, or if it was verified, was swept under the carpet, or if somebody really had to go into the matter to see where this yellow cake had gone at the end of the day, and not having found it after so many intrusive inspections, so many bombings. You forget in the case of Iraq, the war never ended in 91. There was a period of almost 6 years of bombing to maintain that no-fly zone. And that no-fly zone covered most of Iraq. We forget that. And practically anything that could produce even a cycle had been bombed. And therefore, at the end of the day, I mean, the figures that are now coming out is that they used over 150,000 tons of munitions, and very conveniently, the number of civilian casualties has also been calculated as 150,000, which would, even by Western equations, that would mean 1 ton per head. That is the kind of military power that America can actually bring to bear. But if it is brought to bear based on information that is incorrect or definitely off the mark, you can see the amount of, or the level of human tragedy that will cause. Right, let's take each one of these separately. When we talk about the people and their motivations, we note that Iran versus Western powers is dominant tendency of the force of people versus caprice of policy. And a capricious policy can actually result in very little occurring other than human loss. I had used this phrase earlier. When we compare the two militaries, America, their doctrines and their ability to bring in the sort of material that they can, I think this states it, penury versus plenty. And in such cases, plenty normally wins. There are no fairy tales here. Wins means demolishes what existed. The government, we would be looking forward to our Iranian friend to elaborate on this. You have a temporal government. You have a Barack Obama who comes out there and says, hey, let's get out of Afghanistan, and actually makes a plan, bluffs his way through, surges the force level by bringing 30,000 troops and says, by July 14, everybody will be out. You can see these kind of governmental decisions based in a temporal situation will affect this war in a manner that we fully cannot understand. What will be left behind after the initial military onslaught? On the other hand, we have an Islamic republic that believes, the stated belief is, that the sovereign is Allah, nobody else. No parliament, no constitution, no people, Allah. So follow his dictates. Now, those dictates, of course, have been modified considerably, but you can see the spiritual backing, which is more than likely to steal the people, is in there or reflected in the government itself. Next. I think I've mentioned this before. Israel driving US policy causes strategic myopia. And nobody is going to believe that here the superpower is an honest broker. No way. Why? Because of the center heading on top. Israel is driving US policy. When you have a small country with one main insecurity driving policy, there's no course of history out here. The idea is to demolish, remove the nuclear capability that exists in Iran. And they're not going to be satisfied with anything less.
My request is a complete switch off of all machines, the mobile phones and so on, because it's causing problems.
Thank you. And as a superpower, while they say that it's another one of those empires that is crumbling, America is going to be around as a superpower for the next, I would reckon, for the next half a century at least. But the erosion of its credibility as a superpower, as an honest broker, as a broker of any kind, is going to take a tumble if action starts here. Come back to the Iranian people. I have mentioned most of these points except the second last bullet, where I said the quest for legitimacy and the stresses between nationalists, Islamists, and monarchists. Our Iranian friend is going to address this in more detail, so I leave it at this, that there's a problem within that country, and it is not a problem that cannot be reconciled. After all, in democracies, you have people with widely variant and sometimes deviant opinions and beliefs, and they seem to get along reasonably well, and therefore there's no reason to believe that some sort of a reconciliation between the nationalists, Islamists, and monarchists is unlikely. Petropolitics, I think we're all fully aware of this. We have mentioned the two-pillar policy, the sponsoring and promotion of the Saudi kingdom and Iran, the coup that was played out in 1953 to remove Mossadegh and bring in Reza Pahlavi as the Arya Meher, descendant of the sun. He would have succeeded in India, but in Iran, which by then had become an entrenched Islamic society, there was no way that he was going to succeed. And these differences, those that have been in Iran, will, I'm sure, point out. Now, when we talk about ends and means, the means are available for America to do what it wants there, militarily. The ends are not entirely clear. As a promoter of the NPT, here is a signatory of the NPT who has not transgressed it. So why are you hitting his nuclear capabilities? Why should his nuclear capabilities pose a problem to you? After all, he was a willing signatory of the NPT, and even today he says there has been no statement made that I will not abide by the rules of the NPT. He's willing, he's wanting to. And yet, you find that there is a motive which goes to bullet number one. That this policy, should we say continuity, cannot be maintained. I mean, again, it hits credibility. Survival versus control, where one party seeks control of the oil, the energy resources of that area, and it's not control through a military takeover, but control through a pliant regime there. Now, who this pliant regime is going to be is not at all clear. And you can see that the whole thing has not been thought through at all. That if you want to have a pliant regime, you better sponsor some government in exile. But Iran needs no governments in exile. Those that were there were basically monarchists. And they have all been defamed, they've been removed out of those list of people who could actually run this country. And therefore, the skewing of the policy. From the Iranian side, the inabilities of asymmetric forces when faced against a superpower are clear. There is no way that these asymmetric forces are going to create a dent in the military might of America. Again, I come back to this. This is the real danger. That a country such as a proud country, an old country, such as Iran, is not going to take it lying down. And one should learn that lesson of those 444 days or whatever period those hostages were held. They didn't give them up. And neither did they ill-treat them. But they kept them as hostages. We mustn't forget that immediately after the revolution, the next event was this debacle in the desert, as it's been called, which resulted in the hostage taking, and those hostages were kept for the better part of 1.5 years. The genius of war. Genius of war comes with experience, having exposures, having establishments that are tailor-made for operations. Like when America decides to have a AFCOM, that is a African command, it's clear as to what the future is. Why is it that why did they create CENTCOM? You could see why they've created it. Why are they creating AFCOM? It doesn't take very much to extrapolate to say why it is done. And that really is the genius of war, an establishment that is willing to quickly change in order to cater, what they believe, to cater for changing circumstances. Clearly, whatever military action is taken, it will be at the cost of stability in that area. And by stability, we mean disruption. Disruption of shipping, disruption of energy flow, disruption of people. Lessons of Afghanistan, war termination, a function of not some great policymakers in Israel and Tel Aviv or something like that. It's going to be a function of the victim's acceptance. And if the victim, in this case, Iran, is more than likely not to accept the way the Americans chose to terminate, will choose to terminate this conflict. Wars in opposition to the aims of globalization, that's perhaps a bit of an idealistic statement, but you can see it is against the aims of globalization. Globalization was about growth for everybody. The nuclear factor, I briefly touched on this. What happened to Saddam? What happened to Libya? Iranian planners are not blind to all this. That if there's one thing that would prevent a quick military action in North Korea was that they had a bomb. And now you come to a peculiar situation that will I go to war and risk whatever, however minuscule that risk may be, a nuclear exchange, especially where American people are involved. Don't forget, in South Korea, there are many divisions of American soldiers still there, and so too in Japan. So the nuclear factor is going to play a role here. What role it will play? Will Iran continue to shake his head like a Malayali when he says this? He means no. I mean, he means yes. And when he does this, means no. Simple as that. Will he continue to play this charade? Because clearly, there does not appear to be a weaponization or anywhere near weaponization. In fact, American analysts themselves say that for the next 5 years, there's no way that they can come anywhere near a bomb. There are always hazards, friction, and exertion. If there's one lesson that the last 50 years or the last 100 years or maybe the last 1,000 years teaches us, that every plan works up to the first salvo. After the first salvo, your plan has to change. You have to modify. Why? Because there are certain things you never expected would happen. There are certain imponderables that come into play. Kargil is an example. One really tries to understand what is the meaning of this action, where you lost almost, both sides lost almost 700 soldiers. What was the aim? Not really clear. Did they not believe that there would be a response? Was there a miscalculation of such a monumental extent? Intensity of exertions, I've mentioned, will be on the side of the victim here, primarily because it is his survival, as far as he is concerned. And recourse to a strategy of despair, this is something that I'd like to underscore in every one of my slides, that if there is a military conflict, this is the direction in which the Iranian people will be driven to. Nature of war, the information, which is really the last point. Somehow the West believes that information is malleable. I can make my own interpretations, I can create information, I can give a spin to any event that occurs. And I'm now quoting from that 2011 IAEA report. Iran has carried out activities relevant to and consistent with development of nuclear weapons. What are these activities? I mean, surely a report by the IAEA would go into a little more details, and there's no mention of what the activities are. Tomorrow, if you say that it was the physics package that was tried out, which is actually what they're suggesting, Anybody can come and say, hey, Shivakazi, you're building nuclear weapons. Why? Because they're working with a round-looking Diwali cracker. I mean, this is becoming absurd, that the kind of evidence that they're trying to create, none of it is either verifiable or has been verified, or authenticity they believe to be the chairman of the IAEA, who has signed that report. Shades of the reported transfer of yellow cake from Niger to Iraq, to give an excuse. There must be some sort of create a loophole through which you hammer home a couple of fleets and say about 1,000 tomahawks, which is exactly what is being attempted here. And in this case, they will probably do it. That is my own analysis. Do not oppose a military establishment that is so strong, historically has been strong, that has dealt in spinning stories, that has dealt in making statements that are never verifiable. I mean, after all, after I declare war, is there any way of making a reasonable assessment as what would have happened had we not gone to war? There isn't, because the event has occurred. Would anyone have believed that Rumsfeld single-handedly could lead the military establishment the way he did? Could anyone believe that? I think not, and therefore the prognosis isn't all that good. The prognosis is hardly clear, but you can see a military conflict is in the offing. Thank you very much.